Shabbat Shalom. I often find myself surprised by the actions of humanity or the deeds of human beings. And since I'm an optimist who tends to assume the good in other people without even their having earned that reputation, I am not always pleasantly surprised. No matter how old I am, no matter how many gray hairs I've earned, I never cease to be shocked or surprised when people act as often people do. A recent example, although there are many more. In my work supporting the sheltered men on the Upper West Side, I knew that people might let their fears and concerns about perceived safety issues or blight issues or whatever other issues, which could be, I don't want to diminish those concerns, but I knew there was a possibility that that might dictate their responses. And I understood that, and I had empathy from the get-go. But I was shocked when I saw those fears and concerns channeled into racial profiling through the taking of photographs without permission of African-American men sitting on a street corner smoking a cigarette. Once I accepted these responses, I assumed that those opposed to the temporary shelters would go on to their other pursuits when they saw that their fears were not being realized, that the crime had not risen in the neighborhood, that while there had been some initial issues, they were contained within the shelter themselves, and things were improving in the shelter's ability to provide services. Once again, my faith in humanity was not necessarily matched with reality, and I was unpleasantly surprised. No amount of positive local police crime statistics would sway people invested in moving the men. I was once again unpleasantly surprised when people who opposed the position I had sent threatening messages to and revealed the private addresses for some of the lead organizers for those who were supporting the men. Thankfully, it was not me, but many other people I was working with. And this past week, I was fairly shocked and shaken when organizers woke up to hear that the home of Randy Mastro, the lawyer whose conversation had convinced the mayor to move the men, that his home had been vandalizing and that some were blaming the shelter residents when the shelter residents were all present and accounted for on the night of the vandalism. Throughout this process, I've never ceased to be surprised and shocked by actions of my fellow New Yorkers and my fellow Upper West Siders. And of course, this is just one example. There are many times and situations in which I find myself surprised by the nefarious actions and attitudes of my fellow human beings. I mean, after all, we're in election season, so it's not hard to find that sense of surprise. Perhaps some of you are more naturally cynical than me, but even so, I can imagine here that many of us relate to this surprise in some way, shape, or another. Perhaps it is with a relative or coworker with whom you have a contentious relationship. You keep thinking that they'll stop their behavior, they won't do it again, even though you've talked to them, but they continue to do so. Perhaps, like me, you trust human beings a little bit more than can be earned and find yourself surprised when people say or do harmful things. And in these situations, I struggle with how am I supposed to relate to others? How am I supposed to relate to those whose actions I find offensive or even immoral? And how do I not give in to cynicism? If I just give in and accept these attitudes as normal, where does this leave me? And what would I move forward from that? Apparently, I am not the only one who is constantly surprised by the negative actions of human beings. This is a trait that I share with God, or at least the God that is described in the story of Noah and the flood. In the story of Noah and the flood, God is described in there's different authors of the Torah, and they have very different theologies. So the author that's most prevalent in the divine aspects of this story sees God as very human-like, or at least it uses those words. So when I use these words in this drash, I mean it in that way, with the way that the Torah is describing God, not that that's actually God. At the end of last week's Torah portion, at the end of Bereshit, the Torah says that, quote, God saw how great humankind's wickedness was on earth, and how every plan devised by humanity's mind was nothing but evil all the time. Let's think about this for a second. God, the creator and former of humanity, of all of creation, is surprised. This is seemingly new information that God learns from observation, from watching and seeing. An unexpected casualty of the creative forces unleashed that have a life of their own. It then says in our Torah portion that God regrets creation. God's initial feelings remain, or in fact are reiterated at the beginning of Parshat Noah. We hear God say the same idea and speak this to Noah as he gives instructions for Noah to build an ark. I've regretted creation. I shouldn't have done it. Man's kind is evil. Please build an ark. And that's what God says. But what's interesting is that even after 40 days of a flood and over 100 days where the water is receding, we find God still stewing on humanity's evils. Perhaps it was because Noah did not act the ways that God was hoping. Noah didn't fight for humanity or try to save anyone but himself or his family. I mean, possibly, that could be one reason. But God is still sort of processing this 140 plus days later. But at the same time, God has come to a new peace. When Noah comes out of the ark and makes a burnt offering, God smells the pleasing odor, and according to the Torah, says to God's self, "Never again will I doom the earth because of humanity, since the devisings of a human being's mind are evil from their youth, and nor will I destroy every living being as I have done," in chapter 8, verse 21. God comes to a new level of acceptance, albeit a more negative one, of humanity. And this acceptance allows God to live with, even with perhaps some sadness, the realities that emerge when human beings act like human beings. And as we are supposed to imitate the divine, we too are supposed to accept humanity's inclinations and designs. But is that the end of the story? Can that be the end of the story? Rabbi Avital Hochstein from the Shalom Hartman Institute pointed out something in an analysis of this text that struck me and then sort of sent me on a new direction. She notes that in this moment where God is having this conversation of acceptance, God is having an inner monologue or an inner dialogue. The Torah says, "Vayomer Adonai el libo." God is speaking to God's heart. We are not meant to hear this. I mean, we are meant to hear this as readers, but no one else can hear this. And Noah and his family do not hear God's acceptance of the evil of creation. Instead, Noah and his family hear these words, which are the words that we heard this morning that Sam chanted so beautifully. Noah hears these words: "I will now establish my covenant with you and your offspring to come, and with every living thing that is with you, all that have come out of the ark, every living thing on the earth. I will maintain my covenant. Never again shall all flesh be cut off from the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So to God's self, God says, I have to come to some kind of acceptance. But to Noah, God says, let's make a covenant. So this is the thing. God may have had to accept the parts of creation were not as God had intended. And at the same time, come to some peace. And that human beings can sometimes be just completely awful, hurtful, short-sighted, and downright evil. Human beings working together, often even more than individuals. But here the story of Noah is teaching us something important. The acceptance and understanding of humanity's inclinations, or some of humanity's inclinations, does not mean that we give up on humanity. God had a choice after the waters receded. God could have let Noah off the boat, let them do what they wanted, and just saw what was going to happen. Or God could engage in a covenant, give the people parameters. This is where we receive the Noahide laws that say there are some things that humanity has to follow. These are not okay, these 7 things, including not murdering. We have to decide that we're going to be in a relationship that is imperfect, one where there will be people who will fail, but we do not give up. That is the message that God is sending, and that the Torah is sending. So now let's think about imitatio Deo, the act of imitating the divine and learning from the behavior of God as described in the Torah. We learn that yes, human beings and humanity can be absolutely awful, and that our doubts about those who have harmed us personally or those who harm others are not unfounded. Your cynicism is even earned and perhaps even mirrored in the divine. But let us speak our cynicism in our own hearts and not bring it into the public sphere. We find a way to engage. We set expectations for shared norms, and we hold people accountable. But most of all, we do not give up on humanity. We keep trying, despite all obstacles, to do better than the generation that came before us. What a powerful message. What a powerful acknowledgement of the flaws that are designed in our system, and yet the imperative of engaging, the imperative of covenant, of sacredness, and of sacred relationship. Here we are today, 10 days before the election, and I am sure our cynical triggers are coming up over and over again. We are seeing people suppress the vote. We are seeing people lie. We are seeing powerful people do terrible things. And it is easy, it is really even justified and right to feel cynical and to feel frustrated. But that frustration has to be held in our hearts and cannot be expressed in the public sphere, because we cannot give up on humanity. That is our job. I want to offer a prayer for our country in the spirit of this drash and the spirit of the moment that we find ourselves in. I hope that some people get to vote this weekend or this week. And just to remember this teaching as we feel that cynicism creep in, and also remember the covenant and the commitment. God and God of our ancestors, bless this country and all who dwell in it. Help us to experience the blessings in our lives and circumstances, to be vigilant, compassionate, and brave. Strengthen us when we are afraid. Help us to channel our anger so that it moves us toward action. Help us to feel our fear so that we do not become numb. Help us to be generous with others so that we raise each other up. Help us to be humble in our fear, knowing that as vulnerable and as we feel there are those who are at greater risk, and that it is our holy work to stand with them. Help us to taste the sweetness of liberty, to not take for granted the freedoms won in generations past or in recent days, to heal and nourish our democracy, that it may be like a tree planted by the water, whose roots reach down to the stream. It need not fear drought when it comes, its leaves are always green. And let us say, Amen.